Afternoon, everyone. Just thank you for to send the thank you back to Value. We're really excited and thankful for you to you for inviting us to collaborate with you. And we're super excited to be doing this in person for the first time at TIPC, and for us to not be looking after the tech side of things for once. That's nice. Not the three of us just wondering what we're doing with Zoom. So yeah, just to kick things off and introduce myself, I'm Esther Wright. I'm lecturer in digital history at Cardiff University, if you don't already know me, where I'm quite lucky to be able to teach and research historical video games, along with my colleagues who are, I think, behind me, Ian Donald from Edinburgh Napier University and Nick Webber from Birmingham City University. We are the co-conveners of the Historical Games Network, along with Dr. Adam Chapman, and we are...
As promised, no looking after technology.
Thank you very much. You can find us on Twitter at historygamesnet or historicalgames.net. The Historical Games Network, just to give a bit of introduction for those of you who don't already know what the HGN is, it's always been a kind of imagined space, previously digital, but now sort of also physical, which brings together academics and game makers and cultural heritage workers of all kinds to explore the relationship between history and games of all kinds too, and very broadly defined in the way we're thinking about history and games in that sense. Our main aim is really then to engage with different kinds of perspectives and to support and offer platforms to new voices, particularly in this field, and to speak to a very broad audience too, so both professional in terms of academics and game makers and other heritage professionals, but also to a more popular audience, people who are just interested in history and games, to the wider public. And through the blog and our live discussion events, we curate a space in which we can explore historical issues relevant to researchers, to the games industry, and to different kinds of institutions of public history and museums and cultural heritage and things like that. So every quarter we focus on a different theme, this quarter being alternatives. And we have this open call for contributions, which can take different forms. So if you're interested in contributing to the HGN, just send us an email. We're always happy to hear from people and want to publish different perspectives. And our themes always then culminate in a panel discussion, which, as I said, we usually do on Zoom, and we try to draw together an interesting range of people with lots of different perspectives on a specific theme. So before I introduce our speakers, I just also want to say thank you to the Birmingham Centre for Media and Cultural Research for also sponsoring this panel, along with Value, obviously, for giving us this space. But our speakers today, we have Edmund Hayes, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University, and who works on the history of medieval Islam and the Middle East, with a particular interest in early Shia group formation and water history. He acts as a game master. Is this better? Thanks. Sorry. He acts as a game master for Dice on the Nile, in which a group of historians engage in imaginative history by role-playing through a series of adventures set in 8th century Egypt. And Dice on the Nile is the subject of his recent post with the HGN blog that you can read online. Johnnemann Nordhagen is a 20-year veteran of the games industry. He's worked as a QA tester in Sony's research and development department on the BioShock series, and was the founder of the Fulbright Company and the sole programmer on Gone Home, which I'm sure everyone has played because it's great. He founded Dimble Games and headed development over The Water Tastes Like Wine in 2018, which is the subject of his post for the HGN blog, and Museum of Mechanics Lockpicking, released in 2022, and he currently works as an expert technical narrative designer at Ubisoft Stockholm. Corine Gerritsen has a BA degree in history and continued her studies at Utrecht University and completing a research master in ancient studies. She did an internship at the Value Foundation studying the past in video games and has continued in this field on her master's thesis about antiquity in video games, specifically the representation of Rome's enemies. And is kind of continuing to sort of delve into this medium, into video games, in her current PhD project at Leiden University with the Playful Time Machines project. Her blog post, a video rather, was on sort of Roman elements, and particularly fantastical Romans in grand strategy games and other sorts of video games. And for her PhD project, she's preoccupied with the mechanics of video games set in the past and analysing how they kind of make these time machines tick. So the usual format for our discussion panels and how we usually run things is we have about a kind of discussion with our panelists for around 45 minutes or so, with some kind of set questions to kind of get things going, and then we sort of open out to the audience for questions and further discussion, kind of recognising that this is not just about our opinions, but also all of your opinions too. And I think there's lots of sort of papers and things that have been very relevant to this theme of alternatives across the last 2 days. So super kind of keen to hear your perspectives too. And we also have discussion, hopefully, ideally, with our online audience too, via Twitch. So after that, probably way too long spiel, but anyway, into the interesting things. We'll start with a very, very broad question for all of our panellists. How do you actually interpret the idea of alternatives when it comes to approaching historical games? Anyone in particular wants to get started?
Okay, so I think, there's a number of ways to approach that. Obviously, the one that springs to mind most readily for me, at least, is like exploring alternate histories in games. The one of the things that games allows us to do is, like, as we heard before in the Victoria talk or others, we can explore the ways that history might have gone, but chose not to. Sorry for personifying history there, but that I think is the most obvious one. I think that there's some other ones that I looked at in my blog post also, having to do with where the water tastes like wine, is like the sort of stories we choose to focus on in games. We can present alternatives to the kind of accepted view of history, which was part of the point of that game for me, was to look at aspects of American history that I at least was not exposed to going to school in America, getting taught kind of the standard version of American history. This was a way for me to explore other ways of looking at it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, what I think about it is very much in a similar vein, but also I think a lot of games, especially grand strategy games, they allow player to make so many different options, and they allow for such great agency that you will always have alternative history. And that, I think, is a very good thing, not only because a player gets to play the game like 1,000 more times and each time there's something is different, but also because it allows us to see things in new perspectives and allow us to ask new questions.
Yeah, thank you. So some of that applies to my group. Some, as a group playing a tabletop role-playing game, everything's a little more fuzzy, and there are more ongoing decisions about alternatives that can be there at any one time. So, and I can't. So I'm the games master for the game, so I can't speak to everyone's. Well, I can sort of see what I think is going on in the decision-making process, but I guess I would split up into two large sections of what I could continue to talk about, but I'll try not to go on. One is in decision-making, and that's both from a player perspective, it's decision-making. From my perspective, it's creating branching narratives, and what different paths could be, alternative paths could emerge in the narrative. The other one is in terms of world building, which I think speaks to what both of you saying, that there are a number. So I set a game in 8th century Egypt, and I try and use historical source material, but of course there's a process of selection there, so it's not exactly counterfactual history. but of all the sources that exist for 8th century Egypt in Arabic, Greek, Coptic, what are the ones that I'm selecting? What are the worldviews that we're using? And then that's a negotiated process between me setting up the scenarios and the players who take decisions that then change what we're doing together.
Thank you all. So I guess, moving into a question then, I guess more specifically about, is there something particular about games that sort of allows us to imagine alternative histories in different ways to other forms of media, maybe more interesting kind of ways to other forms of media? And sort of sub-question on that is, are there particular styles or genres or even broader sort of types of games that lend themselves to thinking in alternative ways about the past? I mean, it's quite good that we've got kind of a range of different game styles sort of represented here, both digital games and sort of more analog and tabletop games too. So what is it about games more generally, and are there particular kinds of games then that might lend themselves more interestingly to thinking about alternative pasts or histories?
I can go first this time, but I think that, of course, alternative histories are not something that you can only find in video games, because we've been thinking about things like that for a very long time, also in literature. But what games grant us is agency, and we actually get to make decisions, and we get to interact and to live with the histories we created, basically. But I think something also to think about is that the histories we now recognize as histories, in the 19th century, people would see that as alternative histories. And so this historical narrative that changes basically all the time, maybe in games it's way more extreme. I mean, I saw a mod for Romans in space, so that is quite different in that sense. But even small changes that other people might think, oh, that's also an alternative history, maybe with more sources, for example, because you select sources for your game, but as historians we have only a very small part of all the sources that were ever there, and we tell a story with that. So we might even think that our history we have now, maybe that is even an alternative history.
One of the things that I think is most powerful about games as a medium is the ability to place the player within systems and have them not just explore, not just think about those systems, but actually be subject to the pressures of those systems. And I think that that is one really interesting way to explore historical alternatives in every sense, is to allow the player to exist within systems that we've modeled and see those playing out in the pressures of their decisions and so on. I think that's a really fascinating way. I also want to say I was really struck by the presentation yesterday on the digital Hajj by Tyler, what he said about the ability to use time in games, or the way that time plays out in games as a different factor of that interactivity, and the way that that forces players to sit within the space of the imagination more than we might be asked to do in a film or a movie or anything else like that. So that was a really interesting idea.
I think games are very specific. I think so. The way that fictional worlds work in like a novel or a film or something, there's a kind of two-way process with a producer and a recipient, and there is a kind of sense of expectation there about what expectation allows you to enjoy a novel because the rhythm, you're expecting kind of rhythm or certain kinds of outcomes. In a game, though, you're expected to take actions, and so the way the game sort of encodes your expectations has to be more it's more, there's more intervention in what genre. In a way, it's a different set of genres, I guess. So that if you have a sci-fi film versus a sci-fi game, if you have to take an action with it, and maybe this speaks to what you're saying about systems a bit, that if the game has to teach you how to play it, and some of that teaching might be generic, right? So you can see it's a laser gun, so you can shoot with it or whatever it is. That's part of the generic expectation setup that you do have in sort of passive media, but it's more instrumentalized. I guess genre is instrumentalized in games in a way that it's not in passive media. And certainly so again, I wrote about this in my blog. If you have a tabletop playing game, they rely a lot on genre, I think, because you want to know before you start whether you're going to have like horrific body horror or something going on, in which case you can play Call of Cthulhu or some of the more extreme games out there. But if it's like a cutesy, I don't know, anime-inflected game, you don't want to be, you know that you're not going to get that kind of thing. So and that's really dramatically important. And in the online communities about playing tabletop role-playing games, there's a lot of discussion about expectation and setting expectation. But I think genre takes away a lot of that conversation. You don't need to have that conversation if it's already, and I guess buying habits of games, maybe, I don't know how if that factor works in video games in the same way, or if that's specific to the tabletop thing.
I mean, there's definitely genre expectations. I think are built in a similar way, both in the sense of like genre as yes, science fiction versus fantasy, historical things like that, but also the fantasy that's offered through a particular gameplay style as well, right? We were talking earlier about Victoria again. Sorry to bring that in as an example, but the sort of the player fantasy there is one of colonization and expansion, right? And that is a staple of the genre. And this is a very interesting discussion that I was having earlier about like whether you can make something that would satisfy players of that genre without including the problematic elements of colonization or resource exploitation or whatever. As a game developer, that is so fascinating to me. Like, I love to think about how would I make a non-exploitative, colonization, or one of these games in that genre, right? So yes, I think that that there are certain expectations set up for sure for players of genres.
And I think there are also expectations historically seen because, for example, there was this really great example when Valhalla came out. They also made a podcast with all kinds of experts, and these experts just trying to really bring this story of peaceful Vikings, and that they would usually most of their time just want to be farmers and want to create very nice houses for their villages and what crops they were all growing. But that didn't tie in, of course, with what creative direction the game was going. So right after they said that, like 1 minute later in the podcast, there was this really, I think she was called the Foreseer or something, and she would tell how they were always meant for this battle and that they were the strongest and the most axe-wielding of all time. So there you really see the tension of the historical perceived accuracy, but also the expectations of players, like, I still want to be a Viking that can hit things.
I think that actually goes back, that's a really interesting point that goes back to the question about, like, are there different types of games that can explore history more effectively? And I think that maybe that, I don't feel like there's a difference in genre necessarily, but I do think that maybe there's a difference in budget, right? Because what you're talking about is the pressure of the AAA space needing to sell a game to millions of people in order to, make it a viable commercial prospect. but if you are an indie developer looking at selling your game to, you know, tens or maybe if you're lucky hundreds of thousands of people, then your ability to appeal to a niche and explore, you know, different ways of being, like to make your peaceful Viking farming simulator, you have much more freedom to do that, I think, just because of the market realities of it, and I guess even more so if you're, you know, doing it on a grant or something like that. I don't know anything about that world, but yeah.
So I think that's interesting. The difference with a tabletop playing game is, of course, that the expectations, generic expectations, produce actions that would be dictated from above in a video game, right? So that the mechanic in a tabletop role-playing game, the generic expectations produce the mechanics, whereas the mechanics come from the developers who are themselves responding to expectations, I guess. So it's a sort of less mediated process. For a colonization game, I would recommend Pax Pamir, a tabletop role-playing game, where it's set in the 9th century Afghanistan with the great empires, Britain and Russia fighting over Afghanistan, but you get to play the Afghans deciding who they ally with, and you can strategically switch between Russia and Britain to gain certain things. It's an excellent game.
I'm not sure how much I should say about this in public, but I did have I've been exploring a pitch for a Great Game era historical game for a little while that sounds sort of similar to this idea of like pitting these two great powers against each other. I think that's fascinating. I'm definitely going to check that out. Thank you.
I mean, it opens up an interesting question about the different ways that we can sort of interpret alternatives, I guess, and there's lots of different ways we can interpret that, but I think both in terms of games, different kinds of games as an alternative way of making historical arguments, and the way that a lot of kind of research work and clearly a lot of like actual game design work has been done around that, like thinking about what it is specifically uniquely about games that can do that. But then, yeah, the different ways and the different kinds of games and different kinds of game makers have to contend with the extent to which what they're trying to do is seen as alternative. As he's talking about expectations around any period, around any kind of people, around any kind of game form, any kind of studio maybe, or what the difference between a AAA and an indie, what are the expectations around that, and how all of these things can kind of come into play when we're thinking about how well a game could offer anything about history altogether, let alone offering something alternative that might disrupt the kinds of historical knowledge or understanding that people do or don't have. So I guess this comes into a kind of big question, and a question that is around sort of tricky but very frequently used concepts like historical authenticity and historical accuracy or realism, and what kind of role these sorts of terms have in the decisions that have to be made about game content or also about gameplay, and whether or not, I suppose, alternate history games, do they help us to maybe reflect on what these terms might mean in the context of historical games specifically? Do we have strong opinions on these terms? I mean, I do, but it's not about me, so...
Well, whenever I talk, I give some guest lectures on video games at university, and I would usually start out like, what questions would you ask a video game? And if people were not really familiar with game studies, you would usually say, oh yeah, I would check out if it's accurate or not. And I would say like, great, now the next lesson you should learn, that's a terrible question. You cannot ask if it is historically accurate or not, and it is also not a very interesting question to ask, because it always will be, no, not really, they got this part good, but this part bad, and it doesn't help you any further than that. But there's a lot of people that still use this historical accuracy, especially in all kinds of reviews, all kinds of mods, to point to certain what they perceive as problems in a game. For example, every time that people of color or women are somewhere where some people think they should not have been in history, they will say that it's not an historically accurate game, while usually it's just we learn more, and we learn that history wasn't as white and male as we might have thought to this point, but a lot of people use this historically accurate while they actually mean, okay, this doesn't feel historically authentic to me because of what media I consumed or the ideas that I have. So for me, yeah, historical accuracy, I won't really use it. And authenticity is, I think, can be explained in very different ways, but a kind of way you could see it is just how someone perceives history, I guess, or how they think about it.
The last talk I gave at TIPC was on this very subject, in fact, so I have a lot to say about this, but I basically just want to echo what Corine just said. That's also been my experience. The people who are loudest about, at least among the player base, people who are loudest about historical accuracy are people who have a pretty regressive viewpoint and want to impose that on the imagination of developers and other players. So I think that term also is meaningless, but it's definitely bound up in this kind of problematic space, right, where it becomes a little bit of a dog whistle to even start talking about historical accuracy.
So for me, I guess it's all about what's in the sources, and is there a source base for it? And at least that's the starting point. But when you're actually role-playing in 8th century Egypt, it's like we know nothing. You think you know something because normally a historical model is to work from a base of sources and say, well, what's in the sources, and ask questions of the sources, and what can this tell me? But when you're actually sort of walking around virtual, it's like, how much do things cost? Do people sit on chairs or not? There's just really basic things. Do they use their fingers or do they use utensils? Not to mention like really complex things about like gender. Would a woman be in this space? We have a mixed party of a Coptic-speaking sort of bourgeois woman, a Nubian nobleman, an Arab, demobilized Arab fighter, and they are all living in Egypt in a period when Islamic rule has been sort of normalized, and there's multiple languages in play, and we just have this constant pressure of making decisions that we have no basis to answer. So I think within this larger context, I guess, I think it's good to say what are the sources and try and base your start from the sources, but there's also like, infinite area of human experience that isn't covered in the sources that it's fun to play with, and that games give us, or fiction, I guess, give us an opportunity to play with.
What I just wanted to add, what I also think is really interesting, is when people start using the word accurate to describe all kinds of fantasy settings. For example, The Witcher, that is perceived to be in this medieval kind of setting, and then they also start talking about accuracy while it is a fantasy setting. So it's so deeply ingrained in the popular culture that we think, okay, we see wooden houses and we see swords, so this is Middle Ages, so everyone is white and women don't have rights. And it's such an interesting thing to sometimes read, because especially like people with more aggressive opinions, they are very verbal about it, but they say very strange things to me.
On the flip side of that, you could create an alternative from historical sources. It's true that women, as medieval sources, there are fewer women writing, fewer women participating, but you could definitely create alternatives based on the women we do have, or the people of colour we do have. So that, in a sense, is going a little bit against what we've been saying, because that would be based on a sense of accuracy or fact, like let's actually take the fact and do something with, deploy them in a particular way.
I think that's actually that's really interesting, because what just sprang to mind for me is the idea that the fact that games do give us these alternatives also can be a way of curtailing just containing the space, the possibility space there, right? Because like if you have a game in which you can run a counterfactual sort of thing where France conquers Russia or something like that, but it is still set in a world in which conquest is the accepted thing, then in one sense you've given the players alternatives, but in another sense you've kind of still stuck them in this space that is bounded by, well, conquest is the way that the countries interact with each other, right? So I think that's really interesting, the idea that the possibility space that we choose to explore is also, even if we give players alternatives, that is a constrained space anyway.
Yeah, and I guess it's a space that is still, as you were just talking about, constrained by sort of expectations and constrained by form and things like that. So even though in kind of assuming that these games might be, alternative in many different kind of fantastical ways, and might, deviate really, really strongly from a kind of known past or something that, we have sort of sources for, or, all those kinds of things. I guess there's why does this kind of matter? And I suppose for those who, for those of you kind of like actually making games, then why do you think this kind of matters, and how does this kind of drive the kind of choices that you would make in terms of I was kind of struck by in Johnnemann's post where you're talking about with What Tastes Like Wine, particularly sort of the way that it picks and chooses its moments of historical accuracy for kind of maximum impact. And I guess that's kind of the same sort of with you, Ed, is that you're sort of striving not for kind of the role of historical realism, as you kind of put it in your post too, around where are the limits, and in what ways does accuracy or authenticity matter, and at what point do you make that decision that I need to do something different, and what motivates you to do that, to create something alternative, I guess. For Where the Water Tastes Like Wine specifically, it was a game about exposing kind of the lesser told stories from American history, and so that is why I chose to focus the historical research and the kind of the accuracy on those moments specifically. And I think that it worked partly because that was a surprise for players almost, or it was a twist, right? It went against their conception of American history and maybe also games as well. But I think that by presenting that as sort of a peak capstone moment of like, oh look, this is the true story, and just highlighting that part of it, that really helps that accuracy get through, right? The player spends the whole rest of the game, exploring folktales and encountering ghosts and headless horsemen and giant lumberjacks and things like that. But when they meet these characters and have this thing, these people talking to them in earnest voices about their struggles, forming unions or losing their farms or any of this other stuff that we chose to highlight, I think that makes it pack that much more of a punch, I suppose. Yeah, almost the way that kind of these moments where something that is real, it almost kind of throws into sharper relief almost the alternative stuff, but for different kind of meanings and purposes. So yeah.
So I think we do try and be historically accurate, just because we're coming as a group of professional historians who are doing this as a kind of experiment. So we want to, and we have discussions about, oh, that would never happen in a monastery or whatever. However, we also recognize, I guess there's two major sources of non-accuracy which we're okay with. One is that we're modern people living in this virtual world, so we're assuming that our sense of narrative, also we want to have fun, modern people who want to have fun, I guess I would qualify that. The other is we're using Dungeons and Dragons as a system which has its own generic, I guess, weight of gravity, center of gravity. And I guess one other thing would be to say that we use the sense of realism that we use is one that's based in the thought world of the text we study, not a sort of materialist reality. So we don't. So there are sort of flying monks in hagiography, so there are flying monks in this world, there are demons, and it's an enchanted world, and that sort of thing. And that, I wonder, that sounds a little bit like what you're doing too, that you're using text, the thought world of that place, rather than, there's no such thing as a headless horseman or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the idea, is that it's supposed to feel more like you're inhabiting an America of folklore rather than what we know about the historical America. And I'm not actually sure. I suspect that people in 1930s America did not actually literally believe in the Headless Horseman all the time, although maybe they did. But more about the feel of the world than it is about being accurate to, I guess, even their beliefs at the time.
To give another perspective on this, I think sometimes it actually helps, for example, when dealing with ancient world, and actually incorporating gods or mythology in that world can help a player understand just how core to life all of these gods were. And sometimes they pop up in games and they don't really change anything, or they don't even pop up and they're just disregarded because we're modern people, so why would we really care about the gods? They're not real. But when a game actually incorporates that in their mechanics and you have to deal with them and you have to care about these gods, I think that helps you understand just how important those were to ancient people.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of where I was going to move towards in terms of thinking about your video and sort of thinking about particularly why this motivates or matters to players, right? Why this matters to or motivates kind of people who spend presumably quite a lot of time and energy on modding games and putting in different kinds of things. But kind of really struck me in the video that when you were talking about the fact that when games are sort of revolving around kind of Roman history and the Roman Empire, players will still operate around certain assumptions about sort of the fall or the continuation of the Roman Empire, that kind of thing, or the way that they still have to want to put these like very known and real kind of heritage landmarks and like buildings and things like that, or Latin language as these like signifiers of like this kind of accuracy or this real kind of engagement, even when the Paradox games, many grand strategy games, is all about creating the alternatives, right? So what is the kind of the particular role of accuracy or authenticity for the players who are kind of creating the alternate sort of scenarios, I suppose?
I think in this sense it's more about people really like the Romans, and they have a long time that people wrote a lot about them, and one of the questions is always how could such a great empire fall, and linked to that, what if they never fell and we would be all better off, right? And then you get to recreate that in this digital world and live that fantasy. And there are a lot of subreddits that are very, very enthusiastic about these ideas. So that just really creates this very enthusiastic community, creating all kinds of content and basically putting Romans everywhere that they have no place of being, but you can get across them. But on a more serious note, I really was impressed. There's one mod and it translates everything, every text you come across in Skyrim, everything into Latin. And that is not only just a huge work, but it also creates this opportunity to learn different skills in a different way. And I think that maybe we haven't been looking enough at that yet, because I had Latin in high school and I didn't really want to do my homework all of the time, but if it would be like, yeah, you can play this game and maybe you actually learn something, that people would get a bit more enthusiastic about that.
It's like the people who translate Tolkien into Middle English.
Okay, so slightly big questions. This is kind of a big question. What can we learn, and what might a player learn or a developer learn from games which do focus on things that didn't happen? So these kind of counterfactuals or speculative histories, or even as was kind of we're talking about in the paper on flight simulators, even non-historical games, or games you might see as kind of so fantastical or out there that they're non-historical. What can we still kind of learn about the past or about history from these kinds of games? Why is it sort of so important, do you think, I suppose, to have these kind of games that offer these alternative kind of interpretations or ways of engaging with the past?
I'm going to go back to the kind of same well I was drawing from earlier, and say that one thing we can look at is, for example, when people are playing science fiction strategy games or whatever, the focus is still on things like resource extraction and territory control and things that tell us what people's preoccupations are with what we've been told matters in history, I guess, things like that, right? If you're playing a game like Stellaris, which is also made by Paradox, but is a science fiction-based game, it plays in many ways similar to their more historical-based games in the same genre, because it represents our understanding of history as a series of conquests and resource control and diplomatic exchanges and things like that. And it would be interesting to see the ways we would explore genre if we had a different focus about learning history, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that even with historical or non-historical games, which was already mentioned in earlier talks, we can learn a lot. And first of all, because games learns us to look at things differently, give new perspective, ask new questions. That is a very important historical skill to have. And it doesn't matter if you learn that from Skyrim, reading the books there, or any other game, but if you learn that skill, then you can actually, maybe if you're reading a book about history, you can start to wonder, hey, was it really that way? Are there other perspectives? Do I need to question this? And that is one of the most important things, I think, that we can take away from that.
Yeah, speaking as a historian of the medieval Middle East, what I feel we're living in terms of that part of the use of that sort of material in games or in popular culture in general, is that we are living in the alternative. And actually what I'd like to see is having some more history, because basically everything is Arabian Nights, really, in some way or another. Assassin's Creed a little, and there's, with the new Assassin's Creed, it's the Golden Age of Baghdad, and Arabian Nights or Crusades, I should say. So this clash of civilizations, all this very orientalized, sensualized, Orient full of spices and silks, and I think we can explore more than those. So the alternative would be just to actually explore more of the really interesting history. Why not something about the Jews of medieval Cairo, for which there's amazing source base, or the Christians of Baghdad rather than the Muslims of Baghdad. So that would be the alternative. The alternative would be the sort of factual stuff.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about the kind of particular tropes, particular expectations and misconceptions that often get out of certain historical periods or events, right? That actually, we are living in something that is kind of alternate history that we've inherited over sort of maybe hundreds of years of different kinds of interpretation, and is not very close to the actual history. So maybe we do need to move more towards who was actually in these places? Who were actually in these places? What did actually happen? That isn't just informed by various other parts of popular culture.
And if I can just respond to that, and the nice thing about history is that it's really weird, and there's so much in it. So there's always more than whatever we think about, and this kind of speaks to what you're saying about the Roman. Whatever we think that part of the past is, that's the tip of the iceberg, and there's probably more interesting stuff below the surface.
Weirder stuff in history that we can probably invent, so more of history, please, I guess. Okay, I think maybe we could open up to some questions and kind of continue discussion with sort of what people have to say about this.
Okay, you don't even get to host hello, success. So there's been a lot of talking around the presentation of content, right? Whether content is accurate, whether content is authentic, and whether that's something you care about, right? Do you all also find that there's kind of a straining between the standard interaction of games and the presentation of history? Thinking about for examples here of Dungeons and Dragons is fundamentally an interaction set based on westerns, or the Assassin's Creed series is heavily relies on controlling Batman because the Arkham games were popular, right? Is this something that historical games also find strain against, or is this kind of an unthought about dimension in that games just control the way games control?
Anyone particularly want to take that?
I think that's really interesting. I'm not. I'm kind of thinking on my feet here. I'm not sure what it would look like to kind of reconceptualize that. I think it's tricky as a game maker because you want to. There are certain things about making games that are kind of best practices that we've discovered over time, right? That make things feel a particular way, and especially if you're aiming for having a commercially successful game, you need to play to player expectations. So things like controlling Batman or whatever, I think is more of a concession to that. I think it would be very interesting. Actually, the talk about the Forgotten City and the one very common affordance in games these days, of course, is a map, a perfectly accurate map that's available to the player, and often a mini map that shows you exactly where you are at every moment. So I think that was a really interesting talk to me, just to think about how that wouldn't be true of people in history, and how we could use that as a historical form. And it sounds like that, I don't know, but it sounds like developers were doing that both as a game design choice as well as perhaps a historically informed choice. But I think that there are probably places to explore there. I think it's often difficult to as a game maker, to break away from the known best practices and try and push in a direction that is against player expectations, because you have a certain amount of goodwill, but you only get one or two places where you can change things up before people start getting upset with you. I can say from experience.
Something I think a lot about. I think the mechanics of a game have generic implications, and I think we were talking a bit about that when Corine was talking about Valhalla being a hit things game. There's clearly D&D sometimes criticised for that, though, as being very combat intensive, and I think that's true, and it's also but also Wizards of the Coast are trying to make D&D into the only, well, and for many people it is the only tabletop role-playing game. So they try, with the material they put out, to do everything while sort of tacked on top of a game which is about knights, medieval knights fighting, basically, or, you know, it comes out of that wargaming history. Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I just want to add, I don't really create games, so I can't really weigh on this, except that I think that we are now very bound by expectations, and also expectations of a genre. But I think with how quickly things changed over the last 2 decades, that in 2 decades we think of these things in such a different way.
A question you can maybe answer better than the last one, but it's also about the mechanics of alternate history games. I wrote it out. So, do you think that constraints set by history games that allow you to explore alternates can reinforce certain ideas about history by specifically not allowing you to play or fiddle with those constraints? For example, we saw earlier in the presentation about Victoria 3 that the game mechanics about colonization were the only way to interact with these quote-unquote blank spaces on the map. So even if every game you play is a different history, each one of them still has to include this colonialism, and so you can't really use the game to experience history without that colonialism.
Yeah, I think those things can be very limiting, also in a sense, because you just, as a player, you cannot interact with some things in a different way, even if you would want to. And you can see that in grand strategy games a lot, because usually you want to win, and you find out the best ways to get where you want to go, but then you are very limited in the sense in what way you can actually achieve that. And to willfully try to battle it through in a manner that is not encouraged by the game can be very difficult, and also not as much fun. So there's definitely a big tension there, I think.
So that's something that I guess then is sort of a specific, I mean, it's clearly more of a specific limitation in digital games where, you know, you can only ever, even if the game seems very, very limitless or open world or very big, or these very, very complicated grand strategy games, you are still only ever limited, you know, by what the developer has in. Whereas with a kind of, you know, facilitated role-playing game that, you know, or is this creating a kind of artificial binary between digital and non-digital games where everything has limits because, you know, human limits, right? Whether you've actually made a game where you're facilitating a TTRPG, not all possibilities are possible, right?
Yeah, I think I would definitely say, you know, choosing your mechanics is a rhetorical choice, right? And it is something that you're saying. My practice tries to be coming up with the themes and the things that I want to talk about with my game first, and making the mechanics match that. I think that not a lot of game makers think about what they are saying when they choose the mechanics for their games. And I don't actually think that that's true, that's more true of digital games necessarily, because again, a game like Dungeons & Dragons is very much built around the combat mechanics, and you know, there are choices that they've made mechanically, like you know, the stats that you get, right, and what they choose to highlight there as being important to your character or not, and different systems make different choices there. There was, gosh, I don't remember what it was, but there was something that I saw, some game based on Vikings, which used luck as a central mechanic because of the centrality of luck to Vikings. I don't know, I'm not an expert in that, but that's what I read about. And so you're making choices about what's important to you as a game designer from the minute you start to build those mechanics. And also what you're saying about the world and the ways that we interact, you know, going back to the grand strategy example, right, by setting up your mechanics in such a way, you're saying something about the way the world works and what is important to you about the way the world works. You know, there are different types of role-playing games that do, you know, there's the, like the Fiasco system uses a relationship-based way of creating characters rather than a stat-based one, you know, and that says something else about the way that the world works and the things that the developer chooses to highlight with that. So I guess, yes, I agree 100%, and I think that that's a really important thing to think about as we make games.
In response to that question, I'm just going to parrot what I heard Robert Horton say about Crusader Kings franchise, which is, you can play it in different ways, and so you can aim for marital strategies rather than conquest strategies. So in a game that's complicated enough, you can give mechanics that give different different ways of skinning the same cat, which is just sort of family success in that game. That game, though, is too complicated for me to play. So there's a limit to how much complexity that you're going to want. And that's the same, I would say, similar issues in tabletop playing games where and this speaks to what Esther said, that if you really are contemplating an infinite range of choices in every moment of the game, which theoretically could be in a tabletop playing game, then, it's just you have a decision paralysis and it wouldn't be satisfying for anyone. So that the process of creating systems in a tabletop playing game is a process of creating constraints in a way that makes it more satisfying. Whereas in a way maybe it might be a little flipped in the video game model where it's like we want to have as many actions as we want, but we're just going to have hit with axe because that's sort of easy to code. I don't know. But anyway, if you didn't have constraints in a tabletop playing game, then no one would know what they were doing. It would be very unsatisfying. And I think genre is part of that as well. So genre allows you, is a constraint, and also the mechanical system is a set of constraints.
All right, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. So when thinking about alternatives, I very much also was thinking about multi-perspectivity, which also came to the fore like yesterday. But for me, it feels like if we want to use games to be multi-perspective, it's not just about having characters, but also assigning like radically different mechanics to those characters, because it kind of like translates in how those people exist differently in the world. And I guess there are some examples of that with like What Remains of Edith Finch. That's a game that tried to do that at some point. But I was just wondering, like, in your mind, like, how feasible is that really to do in a game form? To just like really radically change up the mechanics per character that you can play as? So that's the question. There you go.
Yeah, I think that is definitely more challenging, right? You have to, if you think about making one game perfect and then having to make 6 of those games perfect, that's obviously more work and harder than doing it once. I also think that the value in doing that, though, is based again around what you would like to say about the differences between those people mechanically, right? So yeah, I would pick your battles there, right? What people may not differ in certain ways, but if you want to highlight the difference between the ways people interact with the world, then that is an excellent place to spend your, mechanical scope points. I don't know, however you want to put it.
And we also have a bunch of questions from the Twitch chat.
Yeah, and I'm going to paraphrase this question a little bit because it's quite long, but it also speaks back to something that Alex and Richard were saying earlier about the way in which people accept the histories that are presented to them in games. So it's kind of an ethical question. Is there an ethical responsibility here connected to this sort of introduction of, in, for example, Ubisoft's case, something that might become a cultural touchstone into the world of an alternative history, which might be problematic or troubling or difficult in its own way. And so does Johnnemann have a sense that that's the sort of thing that's thought about at Ubisoft? And do the rest of you have a sense that there is an ethical duty around this discussion?
I really want to quickly say I'm not speaking at all on behalf of Ubisoft or about Ubisoft at as I sit up here. I am a representative of Dimbold Games, and that is it. Just to make that totally clear. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I will say, I think that should be a question for sure. I don't think that anyone operating the cultural space necessarily thinks about their work having that kind of influence, either because they don't care or because it's hard to imagine that, right? We were talking the other night, though, about the way in which historical media shapes our understanding of history, and I think that is absolutely the case, right? I saw the one that I love to come back to is this study that looked at French people's conception of who was responsible for the victory in World War II, the Allied victory in World War II, and directly after the war, most people thought it was the Soviets, and then after a couple decades of American war movies, most people thought it was the Americans, and so I think that points in the direction of our responsibility to the media that we make does inform people's understanding of history. Yeah, I guess I'm gonna end there.
And I guess it's similar issue. Speech is a ethical act, I guess. So it's part of that, like speaking in the world with affects your words, and then I guess the question of how big is your platform, how loud is your voice, is what comes to mind for these big companies.
All right. We talked earlier a little bit about the tension between agency and systems in video games, placing the player in a system as something interesting to do. And I was immediately thinking of games like BioShock and Spec Ops: The Line that place players in an ideological framework that the game is critical of, but the player doesn't really have the agency to, out of their own accord, escape that ideological system. And I was just wondering how, from a game design perspective, you kind of balance that tension between the lack of freedom and still wanting to criticize this thing that the player themselves cannot express criticism to within the game. That was my question.
Yeah, I actually just finished teaching a narrative design class where I talked about those games also. I think there's some really interesting examples of games that do that, I think in a way that is more interesting than the BioShock or Spec Ops kind of approach, right? Something where you put the player into this bind where they don't have a choice except to do, the wrong thing or whatever, but in a way that doesn't blame the player for that, but really makes them feel the pressures of those systems, right? I think something like Papers, Please is an example I go to all the time. There's another one that is more similar to BioShock, but I'm blanking on it at the moment, unfortunately. Yeah, I think there.
I wanted to come back to sort of the discussions around Victoria and the game mechanics pushing a certain style of play. When we talk about these things in academic discourse, we tend to point an accusing finger, whereas to what extent is it okay to say, look, this was a bad period in history, bad things happened, and in engaging with this, you are doing bad things. And mechanically, making it suboptimal not to engage with colonialism, making it suboptimal to act differently is a way of highlighting the difficulties in history of acting against a prevalent system. And to what extent would that actually be an interesting
an interesting decision. So not making something mechanically suboptimal might not be condoning the alternative. It could be just a highlighting of a past reality or an imagined past reality. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
I think you're absolutely right, especially in these type of games where you're being put to make the same terrible decisions that to win the game or to be better. And then realizing what you do, that also teaches you a lot about why people maybe in history have made that decision. But the only thing that I think is starts to become problematic, because we heard some of the quotes from Victoria. I didn't play it myself, but if you frame some kind of land basically as ready for the taking, only to be colonized, then I think you're going further than just to say, hey, this is less optimal, this is not less optimal choice. You're actually creating a kind of narrative that I would say that's good to point out, and that doesn't really add anything. You won't learn from that, because then it just reinforces this idea of, yeah, it's basically there and you can take it, so why shouldn't you? There's nothing there anyway. And that is, of course, that is another extreme.
Yeah, and I guess popular games will be played by a mixture of lovely people and horrible people and people in between. And so I guess, of course, that means horrible people might draw horrible conclusions. That again raises the question whether the game maker has an ethical responsibility. I think they do. Clearly, games are not always taken as they're directed. So Monopoly was originally a critique of capitalism, as everybody knows, and that doesn't, I wouldn't say that comes out in the gameplay.
So history is often sort of seen as both a source of cautionary tales, but also a source for offering alternatives to present-day life, perhaps more in the context of climate change at the moment. But I feel like as historians or archaeologists, we can sometimes sort of get caught up in our love of history or archaeology, and don't necessarily see it as a means to an end in itself. I was wondering, more as a sort of personal opinion, what you thought was more important in a historical game, whether it's to educate on our lives today, to offer alternatives, or teach things not to do again, or whether it's more important to just educate someone on what happened then, and not necessarily offer any context or end goal to that message.
Who's going to pick? Which one?
Well, I guess, so our group are basically educating ourselves. We're historians, but we're doing something that at the moment is focused on making us better historians by opening up these alternatives and different ways of looking at our material. I would say broadly, though, I do feel quite strongly about the erasure of the Middle Eastern past, which is actually very much a part of world history and European history that is usually erased. So I guess in a larger, if I was trying to make a larger educational aim, it would be something connected to that, right? So, but we recorded our session, so we're thinking of making a podcast, so we might get there. But currently, it's just for ourselves.
I think in a sense neither, because although games can greatly be used for all kind of historical teaching, in the end they are games and they are meant also to be just fun. And in that sense, the most important thing maybe is just to instill this enthusiasm for history and wanting to know more about it, and really starting this whole process of wanting to question things. And I think that's way more important than these very specific things.
I guess I'll take the remaining position left here. Not really, but I flatter myself by thinking that I create, capital A art, and that everything that I make is trying to say something about how we are and should be as human beings. So I think that I use history as a way to show us, to draw comparisons, I guess. Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is a game that is meant to hold up a mirror to the United States as it is today by showing us the Great Depression era decisions that we made, and also the histories that we've forgotten about, and that's that is explicitly the purpose of the game. So.
Thanks everyone. I'm kind of picking up on what Ed just said. Actually, you said you were using this game as a means to do history better, and the kind of scholarship on alternatives and counterfactual history, at its best, and to massively oversimplify it, is to better understand the past through thinking about alternatives and what may have happened and things like that. And I'm curious because you mentioned earlier about how different media has done this, and obviously we've got ancient historical examples of alternatives being thought about intellectually, and then you've got fiction doing it in novels and plays and film, TV, all the way through to games. So what is it about games that can help in that act of trying to think about alternatives to better understand the past? What you said, Ed, that you want more history, seems to suggest that they failed at doing precisely that, that in thinking alternatives they perhaps just got us further away from the past. But do you think there are ways in which they can specifically help that perhaps in films and in novels and things that they can't? I mean, we've talked about the interactive point, but is there anything more that they can do to help us better understand the past through presenting alternatives?
Yeah, I feel that's about 10 questions. all very good and interesting ones. I guess I'm trying to do something small. And I think when I said it's making me a better historian, I think being faced with trying to reconstruct everything in a world rather than just what my sources tell me is a very useful imaginative exercise. In terms of the failure of the current cultural production surrounding the Middle East, medieval Middle East, I wouldn't say that's all history. I think that specifically we have, so there was a process in, all medieval historians know that intellectual culture in Arabic is immensely important. When Aristotle gets translated, Aristotle in Arabic gets translated into Latin, and that makes a massive difference to Western intellectual culture. In the Renaissance, that debt to Arabic was erased, and we're still living with that, I would say. And that's just intellectual history, but I would say that in the history of capitalism, in the history of science, people who are specialists in these fields know very much that there's a debt, and then Europe erased their debt to a common medieval, common post-Roman world, right? We're all heirs of the Roman Greek heritage. So I guess if there were a way to insert that more into the culture, I think that would be healthy. So.
In a different kind of sense of alternative history, I think for especially antique history, it can be very helpful because almost all of the sources are about the upper layer of the society, and we have very, very little on just the normal people walking there. So every time you see in Assassin's Creed Origins or whatever, they had to ask themselves questions like, how would people have lived? What would their jobs look like? What would they have needed for those jobs? And this is also what you see is basically alternative history, because we don't know, because there are not a lot has been left to us. A lot was of wood or textile, and it just doesn't preserve very well. So this helps us and people who come across that to not only think about that upper layer, but also realize that a lot of, when we talk about the Romans or the Greeks, that there were very many just normal people with normal people problems, and not only these generals running around and telling armies what to do.
Yeah, and I think that elite, non-elite aspect is very, very important. That's also something that I can do. We can do in our group by trying to at least think about the empty spaces that are not filled with elite sources, even if we can't actually get that far towards it.
Yeah. Maybe following up the other perspective that you brought up with the everyday, right? So like when I went from trying to do my PhD to making games, and then obviously wanting to make historical games because I did it in history, what I always found fascinating is less this, I would call it an obsession with the past rather than history in games. So like really interested in more like this idea that there was something really once, and more history as this practice we have today about writing about the past. And we also do that, and that links to other questions for somebody else that still to come. So like history is not just about the past, it's also about the future and where we are right now. And for me, all of that is kind of accumulating in, and I feel like everybody's shying around that, but it's not named, that's why I'm asking for it, is historical theory. So it's like, how do we actually write or film or depict or reconstruct, or because I'm a postmodernist, construct history. So, and I was wondering if you see that as a relevant avenue, because I feel we had Victoria today, but we talk about Assassin's Creed. There's definitely an influence of historical theory that the influence not only narratives but also the mechanics of these games. But I think the makers rarely talk about it. Sometimes they don't know that they're talking about it, but it's a fascinating avenue to even they don't have to be experts, but just rough outlines of this that could inform the creators of making historical games to kind of looking at different avenues. And that was the link to your last comment, Corine, which would be everyday history or microhistory, right? So you would think there is a possibility of, if there would be some possibility to break down historical theory so it's readable for your non-historian, because in most senses I don't think it is, that there would be use for that. That is then my question, I think.
Well, to answer this very long question, and I hope I distill it right, but I think it's not only a question of our tradition of history, which is clearly there and shows in a lot of narrative, but also who is allowed to make this history, and are game makers allowed to create history, and are other non-traditional academic venues, are they also creating histories that are as real as others, I think. But maybe you want to add something?
Well, I don't know about historical theory, but definitely games as arguments, I think, is something that, a game that if you make a game where you are the path to success is through making good marriage alliances, for example, then you're making an argument about how success worked in history. So that's slightly different, but it relates to what you say, I guess. That's also Robert Horton.
Yeah, the fact that these games are there's this big obsession with the past and quite specifics of the past, but history isn't history's not the past, it's how we make meaning out of it, and that is informed by lots of people talking about different kinds of historical theory, that even if that is very dense and not readable, it still informs the way that people think about how things work. So, yeah.
All right, more questions from the chat.
Thank you. So, is there a difficulty using alternative history games in education because they allow for unhistorical outcomes?
Ooh.
I think that really depends on in what way you're using this as an educational tool, because I would say it's absolutely, you can use it and there's no problem that it's not teaching actual history, because it's just history and not the past, and we already constructed this idea. So what I said, once again, it's way more important that you learn to see these perspectives, maybe learn about decision taking, or why certain decisions were made even though they're morally now not the good choice, and that you can learn very well from all kinds of alternative histories. So yeah, definitely I don't see a problem as long as you give them the right context, I would say.
This is not a chat question, this is a me question. So, and I guess it focuses initially on Ed's activities, but it's more broad, which is, in medieval terms, there's often huge holes in our source material, right? There's huge gaps, and we're generally interpolating, we're trying to work out what happened in those spaces. And given what you talked about the process of trying to create a world in which people can play, and that must be presumably true of a game developer as well, actually so much of what we're doing is kind of making stuff up within a framework of knowledge, which is broadly what historians do, right? We agree that history is a creative act. So, are alternative history, do we need to distinguish alternative histories? Aren't they just histories?
The existential question.
Well, I mean, this is about doing history rather than games, but I think a responsible way is to show what the evidence is and then distinguish the interpretation. So, I don't know if you, in games context, I'm not sure how you do that. Because you want to make it immersive, you want to get people to suspend their disbelief, I guess. So that process of showing your working, showing your evidence, and distinguishing speculation from that, I guess, is going to be, not impossible, but you could definitely have a game about sources, interpreting sources that would highlight that, but I guess that's not mostly what you have.
Well, for the question, do we need to distinguish between that there are alternative histories and there are alternative histories as far as I'm concerned, and I think with sources you can interpret them in multiple ways, and it's fine to have a game based on a different interpretation or maybe a possible version of the past, but if people start presenting really questionable things or ancient aliens and call it history in a sense, then maybe the distinction should be made.
Yeah, I didn't think about, I'm going to talk about Ubisoft, so you don't have to talk about Ubisoft. But, in kind of games where there is some attempt to kind of show evidence and show sources, like Assassin's Creed's Discovery Tours, for example, where they sort of incorporate sort of objects from museums or different kinds of visual evidence, lots of different kinds of evidence as a sort of more of a museum experience anyway. But they also offer an interpretation alongside that evidence, but you don't get much sense of kind of who or how that interpretation has been written. So it's kind of very heavy into the sources and then sort of like implicit, here's the one way to interpret this source because you are now looking at this like amazingly, immersively, all these terrible words we want to use, realization of a particular period. Whereas in other games you've got it's heavy on the interpretation, like embedded in, but not so much about the sources. So what's the kind of most interesting way of doing both of those things? Is there an interesting way of actually doing all of these things at once? Was that just thinking too much like a historian and that's like a game developer?
I mean, I feel there are games where you're interpreting evidence and taking action further, but you would be a better person to talk about that than me, but right.
Actually, I guess Gone Home is kind of an example of a game where one does that, so I think one could imagine a Gone Home-like set with a more explicitly historical, I mean, I guess technically the 90s are historical, but as old as that makes me feel. Yeah.
But that's exactly the kind of game that I use with my students to sort of think about kind of what Adam Chapman talks about, this idea of the player as historian, right? Where it's less about kind of learning something about the past, but more learning things about how historical practice actually works and how identifying evidence and things that have been put into the game is less about the development necessarily giving you an interpretation, though they're always going to give you an interpretation. It's about how you can explore and create your own sense of kind of piece together what's happened.
Yeah. And there is a rush to that sort of detective work, right, of being a historian, so there's no reason you can't gamify that rush.
We have about a minute, so if we want to do a last round of points from the panel.
Final thoughts on what alternatives people to you? Too big, too much? Okay. Well, in that case, I guess we haven't got any more questions. We're probably just going to wrap it there. But thank you for your engagement and for your sort of questions and sort of interactions. And thank you to our panelists for sitting up here for an hour and a half and talking to each other and with you. I guess, a round of applause.